A couple other things. First, before I dive into our message today, so August 21st through August 23rd, it's a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. I want you to kind of just mark your calendars, which is kind of interesting. So we're in the book of Hebrews, and then we're going to finish up, and then the week after that, August 21st, we have a guy he's actually becoming just a friend of mine. I've been around him a few times. He has such a sensitive heart to the Father. And he's just, like my prayer is that it's going to kind of spill out onto us. And but this is interesting. His name is Matthew Rudolph, and he is a Messianic Jew. He loves Jesus with everything that he has and has a heart to just tell the body of Christ about things that maybe it's hard for us to understand with how we're connected to a greater family that in the Bible. So there's some interest. So what we're going to do, we're going to partner with Grace Fellowship together. It's going to be a really cool thing. Grace Fellowship in town is one of our like sister churches. We're great friends, and but he's going to be with us Sunday morning, August 21st, and we're going to give you some more details about how that weekend's going to be. But you will. You'll learn a lot. Even if you know a lot, you're going to learn a lot. And even if you already know a lot, you're going to be impacted at a heart level, I'm praying. So anyways, there you go. And I think it's kind of interesting because we're in the book of Hebrews. We're going to bookend that with a conference that's going to really let us know, even at a greater level, some of those roots in Hebrew culture and Jewish things that maybe we don't even that we don't even do and operate in right now. But we get to kind of see what our extended family is like. And after that, when we come into September, we're gonna work out some more details. You're gonna be excited about this. We're gonna do a 21-day fast. What? No, what? No, like woohoo or no? We're gonna come. I think it's starting in September sometime. I don't have the date right here, but we're gonna do 21-day fast. Bookend it with some corporate prayer, with the purpose of just saying, God, we want your presence. Like we just want you. And part of what fasting does is put some, whether it's food or media or some other type of fast, whatever, is it like says, hey, I'm denying this for the purpose of intentionally stepping into a greater place of hearing your voice, of sensing your presence and all of this. So we're just going to, anyways, I'm excited, not about the fasting part, but about everything leading up to that. I just, I'm an expert eater. I've been doing it for almost 42 years. So it's hard to like put that on pause. All right. All the laughter means that my jokes aren't hitting yet, so I'm going to have to try harder. Today. Hey, we're in the book of Hebrews. The whole point about Hebrews has been, and we're now in week 8. The whole point about Hebrews is Jesus is greater than. Jesus is greater than. The author is talking to an audience. If you haven't been with us, if you're joining us for the first time online or here in person, the author is talking to a group of really Messianic Jews. In other words, Jews that love Jesus, that have come out of Orthodox Judaism. And there were about 30 years or so after that, and now they're being persecuted, and there's lots of pressures, and there's like this new way, this new covenant, this new way of following Jesus, and now they're being tempted because of pressure and persecution to go back to Orthodox Judaism, to go back to Old Covenant, to go back to 613 laws. Like, hey, well, at least we can at least that's tangible, right? At least we can kind of see that and wrap our brain around it and all of this. And so they're being tempted to go back. And the author is saying, hey, don't give up. Don't go back. Jesus is greater. I promise you. And so we've been seeing that every chapter. Hey, Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater. Don't give up. It's way better than that. It's way better than that. And so today, the thing we want to talk about is in Hebrews chapter 8, and a little bit of kind of referencing 9. I'm probably going to skip to chapter 10 next week, just for sake of trying to get through in time, you know. I mean, I guess I could choose to just whatever, but we're going to just try. You could take Hebrews and go for like a whole year on it. And this sermon today, oh my goodness, like would you just empathize with me? Like this sermon today could be like a whole series. and then I'm going to try to get it down to about 2 hours for you. All right, maybe not. If you're a guest, you're like, oh, what church today? No, all right. It'll be less than that. It'll be a little bit south of 2 hours. So today we're going to talk about a greater covenant. A greater covenant. And Jesus gives us a greater covenant. And we're gonna like, what is this? What does this mean? And so, hey, to start out, every so often I watch TV, right? And some of you are like, you don't watch TV. Some of you are like, Pastor watches TV? No way, right? Just like, just super non-religious. Let me just let you know, ever so often, like every day. No, I'm just joking. No, but there's this show that it's kind of disturbing when you think about it. All right, and I'm going to explain it to you. It's called Married at First Sight. Now, have you ever? No, you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to give it up that you also watch TV. But listen, like the concept of this show is, I mean, it makes you want to watch it because you're like, no way. You're like, really? Listen, so there's all these people that sign up because what they want is they want to get married, and whatever they've been doing in life hasn't worked, and all of this, and so they're like, okay. So what they do is they trust these experts, some psychologists. There's actually even a pastor on, whatever you want to believe about all that, right? And there's a pastor, there's a couple experts, all this. And through all of their, science and then expertise of working with couples and marriages and all of this, they actually match people without them ever meeting. And the first time, catch this, the first time they meet is on their wedding day. The groom is standing up at the altar, the bride's coming down, and he has never met her before. Everyone whew. So they do some backstory stuff, and they're interviewing family members. Some of these family members are like irate. They're like, I can't believe that they're signing up for this like sham of a marriage and all of this type of stuff, and they've never met, and this thing isn't going to work, and all. I mean, it's like crazy. Like people are. Can you imagine? And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, there's no way. Like if my daughter wanted to sign up for that, there's no way. Like I would kidnap her or something. Like there's no way we would let her. I don't know. Maybe not. Can you roll that? Can you cut that part out? All right. And so that's the premise. So then they come up, and the bride's standing there, the groom's standing here. There's a officiant, and they recite vows to each other, like you would in a normal. I mean, it's like a full-on wedding. They recite these vows, having never met each other ever. Now, there's been arranged marriages for centuries, right? I mean, in other cultures and all this type of stuff. But imagine never having met. And so they do this. They recite these vows and all of this, and then they go on their honeymoon. Yeah, they go. I mean, isn't that just? They go on their honeymoon. They go on a honeymoon, and then 8 weeks. They have 8 weeks to fall in love. I know. Come on. I mean, everyone's like just 8 weeks to fall in love and work these things out. Now, watch this. It's a legally binding marriage. Now, if I were to write the show, I would say, how about dating at first sight? How about dating at first sight, and then at the end of 8 weeks, you get to decide if you want to be married or not? Anyone thinks that'd be a better idea? Yeah. Not them. Why? Evidently, in their wisdom, they thought, the covenant of marriage is so strong. They're wondering, hey, in this experiment, would people choose to be faithful and love each other and grow in love and honor the commitment they made 8 weeks prior? Would they honor that even if they haven't known each other for, forever? I mean, they just didn't know each other. So they do this, and honestly, so what happens is at the end of that 8 weeks is they get to decide, do I want to stay married or get a divorce? Craziness. Here's what you learn about it. the only way out is divorce. In other words, the covenant, the commitment they made together was that strong. Isn't that just like, to me what I was thinking about was at some level, Hollywood is got at least something right. That this is that important. That you don't just get to get into it willy-nilly and you don't get to get out of it willy-nilly. This is a covenant. Even if you didn't know each other, you made a commitment and now there's consequences involved in this thing. It's interesting. So whether or not, I'm not saying you should go out and watch it. I'm saying it's a really interesting thing. And it was a crazy high level of commitment that these people are being called to. So today, this is what I want you to know. We're talking about a greater covenant. And we're talking about, here's this thought that I hope that you get between now and the end, is this. You will relate to God in a covenant relationship. The question is it old covenant or new covenant? You will relate to God in a covenant relationship. The question is it old covenant or is it new covenant? And so the premise here today is, hey, Jesus has a greater covenant for you. Jesus, they wanted to go back to the old covenant, and he said, hey, Jesus is better, and it's true. But covenant is a word. Now, and I keep saying this, and some of you are like, man, covenant, what is covenant? Covenant is a word and a theme that just keeps popping up when you read the Bible. And if you haven't read the Bible much, like you're gonna learn about it today. But if you read the Bible, you're like, yeah, I hear about this. We hear about old covenant. We hear about new covenant. We hear about all kinds of different covenants in the Bible. It's a word. It's a theme that keeps coming up. And then Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, specifically addresses covenant. And so, what is a covenant? Anyone wondering what a covenant is and what makes it different? Because there's words that we think are like synonymous with covenant, and we, and so we might have a definition. When we hear the word covenant, it almost, doesn't it sound like a fancy word for contract? Or fancy word for agreement? You're like, well, yeah, contracts. We sign contracts all the time. We sign agreements all the time. Anybody ever had someone break a promise to you? Right? Anyone ever made a promise? Raise your hand if you made the promise and you broke it, right? Anyone ever broken a promise? Yeah, all right, we got some honest people here. So can I tell you, that's not necessarily the same thing as covenant. Man, there's times where I have, any of you, you like to read all the fine print on computer agreements and things like this. There's long stuff, and at the end it says accept or do not accept, right? And if you just I'm not reading that, and you just click accept. Anybody? Yeah, me too. They're that's like a binding agreement. You just made an agreement. I have a friend who literally reads every single one of those before he's good for him. Good for him. So we're talking, so this word covenant, it's actually a much more weightier word than just a contract or an agreement. And we're what is this? Here's a definition. This is one definition. A covenant is a solemn agreement between two parties for the purpose of creating and maintaining a successful relationship. And we're going to dive into biblical covenant here in just a minute. But when we talk about covenants in the Bible, usually, and there's all kinds of different, in fact, Pastor Jen in school, or Kingdom School of Transformation in KSOT, she did a brilliant, took a whole lot longer than a 40-minute message. She went and talked about the Jewish wedding ceremony and the covenant that happens in a Jewish wedding ceremony, how that parallels the covenant with Jesus and what he did for us on the. It's amazing. So if whenever that's coming up again, you guys should do that. We're gonna and give you just a snapshot of covenant this morning. But so it's a solemn agreement between two parties for the purpose of creating and maintaining a successful relationship. And usually there was a sacrifice made, or there was a meal shared, or both. And so you had this thing. So go with me. This was a big deal, especially in the Old Testament. And from the word in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, the word for covenant actually means to cut. It means like to cut. So that word in the Hebrew, so you start to, so what's this mean? What's covenant? Well, so the word literally means to cut. In other words, there's bloodshed involved. There's bloodshed involved. And a common way for the contracting parties to make the covenant in the Old Testament is there would be an animal that would be literally sliced or cut in two. And I mean, imagine this, they were professional butchers evidently, right? They would cut the animal in two. They would lay the pieces on its side, and you imagine the bloody mess and the animal cut in two. And then the two parties that are making a covenant together, an agreement, the promises, all the things involved, they would walk between the pieces of the animal. And here's the thought that they were expressing. They were expressing this thought: may I be torn apart like these animals if I fail to uphold my part of this covenant. Now, thank God, that doesn't happen when I click accept on iTunes. Right? Can we all agree that that's different than a covenant? And so, Old Testament, they're saying, this is a big deal. You are entering into a solemn, holy agreement that has major, major ramifications and consequences, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And so this is covenant. And so remember, the author of Hebrews is talking about Old Covenant, New Covenant. But the theme here is this is a big deal. And I want to just say, if you've entered into a covenant with the Lord and it was just like breezed through the fine print and clicked accept, can I just say, the covenant that you're in is a big deal. Monumental. Biblical covenants are much different than agreements we make today, often different than agreements. The thing that would be closest would be marriage when we do wedding ceremonies. But I want to give you just a few distinctives of a biblical covenant. When we look and we research and we look at some biblical covenants, first of all, a biblical covenant makes two into one. A biblical covenant, and the easiest way to see that is marriage, and that's the most intimate part of it. But at the very least, the two parties come together with like-minded and with going after relationship. In fact, a covenant always changes the relationship. We were separate, we were two families, and now the fathers come together and walk through the animal, the bloody animal, and now the two families have a covenant, or it's two nations, and the two kings come together and walk through this animal, and now there's a different relationship between the two nations, or whatever it was. That was what happened. And so first of all, in a biblical covenant, two become one. There's a difference, a change in their relationship. But then two, you guys, this is part where we understand, right? A biblical covenant involves promises. There's promises. And so party A promises, I will do such and such and such and such. And party B promises, I will do such and such and such and such. And then there's consequences if we don't live up to that. May it be like the animal that I just walked through. There's major consequences that happen if we don't fulfill our part of the promise, our part of the covenant. You guys love this? Warm, fuzzy goosebumps yet? All right, come on. Here we go. Number three, distinctives of biblical covenants. Number three is a biblical covenant involves families and bloodlines. Now this is interesting because biblical covenants were never just meant to affect the two parties that come together. And you guys are starting to see some parallelism between this and even marriage, right? Isn't this just crazy? But it was never meant to just affect the two parties that come together. I always tell people when they're getting married, hey, guess what? You're not just marrying each other, you're marrying each other's families. How many know, if you didn't know that, you know that now? All right. Some of it's way better than others. Okay. My in-laws are great, by the way, just clearing the air. It involves families and bloodlines. And so it was never just meant to affect the parties involved. In fact, the descendants were bound by the same agreements. Man, it's like the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren were bound by the same agreements that were made years and years before, and they might not have even ever been part of that. But they're bound by it because covenants affected families and bloodlines. It was just really interesting. And in fact, they would have the same consequences, but then they would also have the same blessings. And so whatever blessing that came from that type of covenant, it would just continue to roll downhill. And families and generations and generations and generations would receive the blessings. But then generations later, if that covenant was broken, they also received the same consequences. Amazing, huh? All right. Fourth, a biblical covenant is deeply spiritual. Deeply spiritual. And this is where, like in Genesis 21, when you had Jacob and Laban. Do you guys remember Genesis 21, Jacob and Laban? I would encourage you to read it. There's examples of this type of stuff all throughout Scripture. Jacob, just to sum up, we're not going to dive deep into the story, but Jacob was working for his uncle Laban for years and years and years. There's a whole, accidentally married the wrong woman. Great story, by the way. Great. You thought Married at First Sight was a great TV show. Come on, right? They should, accidentally married the wrong person. Anyway, so he had to then work more and then ended up married the right person. Messed up. You think your family's messed up. Come on, right? And so that whole thing happened, and eventually the story goes where Jacob, he has established himself in wealth with cattle and sheep and all of this stuff, and servants and family and extended family, and he's got a lot. He's done well for himself, and so they decide to leave his uncle Laban's place, and they go on a journey. And Laban's like, "What? What's going on?" And so Laban comes out and meets Jacob at a particular place. And at this particular place, they kind of like duke it. Well, they don't really duke it out, but they have a intense fellowship. They talk, right? Any of you ever had intense fellowship with somebody? Yeah. They've had intense fellowship, and they talk it out, and they come up with a covenant where I'm not going to cross into your territory, and you're not going to cross into my territory. But guess what was interesting? They invited God to be a witness to the covenant. He was right there. They invited God to be the witness. A covenant is deeply spiritual. And now God gets to hold them accountable to the promises that they made. Anybody noticing any similarities between standing before God and the witnesses and making a vow to somebody that I will, for you and you alone, forever until death do us part? Some people, they go and stand before a judge, and that's great, and that might be your story, or they go and do something else. But there is something spiritual that happens at a wedding when we invite God to stand there and be a witness of the covenant that we're making. Incredible parallelisms here, by the way, right? So the two of them, Jacob and Laban, they called God to be a witness, which leads us to this last distinctive. There may be more, but watch this. A biblical covenant is not easily broken. You've called God to be a witness. Now God himself, is holding you accountable to the covenant, and biblical covenants aren't easily broken. When I do premarital counseling or get ready to perform a wedding ceremony with a couple, and there may be some people that have been a part of that, and we talk, and this is what we say. We say things like this: "Hey, it's kind of like you have two rivers that come together and become one river, and it's deeper and wider and better than before, but it's not one person joining their life to another person or this person joining their life to that person. It is like the two becoming one." And we talk about this, and so we go through all of that, and we have weeks and weeks of just counseling. And I tell this to a couple when they come to meet with me. One of my favorite things, by the way, is premarital counseling, because they haven't messed it up yet, right? And so I mean, I like all marriage counseling, by the way, but premarital is like nice because we get to say, hey, don't do it the way I did it. Do it a better way, right? And so they're sitting there like wanting to learn, wanting to do this thing right and all of this. And I say things to them throughout this process of premarital, like, hey, listen, like, you don't get to just like do it your way the whole time. Like there's this compromise and there's like all kinds of great things that come with marriage, and it makes you better. It's iron sharpening iron. Like this is like this institution of marriage. But I tell them this, hey, listen, you probably are going to get married whether or not I officiate your wedding or not. Here's the thing. When a couple wants to get married and they call on the pastor to officiate their wedding, they're like already, like the train has already left the building. Like they're getting married, you know. Ever so often they go through premarital and they're like, oh, I think I'm not going to get married. But that's like 0.1% of the time. Like most of the time they're ready to get married. They're going to get married. And so this is what happens. I say, hey, listen, this is what marriage is, marriage counseling. This is what marriage counseling is. I am helping you go into marriage with your eyes wide open. Instead of you like being blinded and going into marriage and then like a year later being like, who are you and what have you done with my spouse? Like you get to experience the hard times with a little bit of like a tool in your tool belt, with an understanding that, oh, yeah, Pastor Jonathan told me that this thing was coming up. And so we get to the wedding ceremony, and then they share vows. And they commit to you and you alone until death do us part and all this type of stuff before God and all these witnesses. And usually what happens then is after the ceremony, we go to a place, oftentimes if it's at this church, it might be in the conference room or something, and the photographer comes in and we have these documents, these marriage certificates, and we sign and there's pictures, and then quickly we give that in the envelope to Leslie, and Leslie mails it off, to some, because hey, we don't want like this thing where like 4 years later we realize that was never sent in, and you're like, what happened, right? So we send it off for them. We make sure that we get it off for them, and then they go on their honeymoon. They come back and they have a marriage certificate usually, and this is what they know now. The only way out is what? Divorce. It's binding. It's a big deal. A biblical covenant is not easily broken. There was an Old Testament example of a biblical covenant that wasn't easily broken, where Joshua actually comes into the promised land and he starts to interact with this group of people called the Gibeonites. You guys remember hearing about the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua? And so Joshua's interacting with them, but he doesn't know who they are because they've disguised themselves. They trick him. Hey, we're not really like the enemy. And so he thinks that they're like friendly, whatever. And so he enters into a covenant that actually God didn't want them to enter into, but they enter into it anyways. It's a covenant. It's a binding covenant. And they do this, and now the Gibeonites and the Israelites are in covenant for generation after generation after generation. And then years and years and years later, King Saul tries to go ahead and break the covenant by getting rid of the Gibeonites, and they experience the consequences of generations later breaking a covenant, even one that God didn't want them to enter into. I mean, crazy stuff. Side note, when I was in Israel, I stayed in a place where they would say that the Gibeonites would have resided. And it's like the only place in Israel where there's Muslims that are pro Jewish. It's like there's like peace in this place, and it's just a really interesting thing that even centuries and millennia later, there's still the residual effect of a biblical covenant made back in Joshua's time. Isn't that interesting? So covenants, biblical covenants, not easily broken. So when the author of Hebrews is talking to this audience, he's comparing this to what is called the Old Covenant, the law of Moses. And the Old Covenant, in fact, some scholars split the Bible into two, and instead of calling it Old Testament and New Testament, they call it Old Covenant and New Covenant. And so there's all kinds of covenants in the Bible, but this one specifically, the author of Hebrews is looking at and saying, hey, let's not go back to the old covenant called the law of Moses. Let's enter into this new covenant. And law of Moses started like Exodus chapter 20. Do you guys remember when Moses goes on the mountain and God downloads on stone tablets what? The Ten Commandments, right? And it starts, it like kickstarts like the whole like Old Testament, the whole new Old Covenant, and it goes from there into like 613 laws that they were meant to keep. And God's like, I will do this. I will be your God. You'll be my people. I'm the God that led you out of Egypt. All of this type of stuff. These are the things that are required for you to do. This is your end of the bargain, your end of the covenant. Here's my end of the covenant. The only problem was what? It was impossible to keep. It was impossible for them to live up to the standard of God. And so they would continually break God's commandments. Because did you know that the Bible says if you break one of his commandments, it's as if you broke all of them? So imagine this. You're like, hey, God, I'm good on 600, but I'm fuzzy on 13 of them. I mean, that's a pretty good percentage. Like if you're like Tammy, you were a teacher, right? That's a fairly good grade. What do you do, right? You divide 600 by 613, get. That's not God's standard. God's standard was perfection. He's like, if you broke one, you broke them all. And so they would continually, maybe even with good hearts and good intentions, and sometimes with wicked hearts, but they would continually break God's commandments. And the price for their sin was death. And so God set up a system of priests and sacrifices that would have to be done time after time after time again because breaking God's commandment required death, required bloodshed. And so instead of them having to die, it was an animal that would have to die. And so they would do this, and every year the sacrifice had to be done again and again, symbolizing that the covenant that had been broken because of sin had now once again been made whole and brought back into alignment because of a sacrifice. And you want to know what that annual time was? It's the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And so they would do this. And under the Old Covenant, every time there was sin, relationship with God was broken. And God was only approachable through prophets, priests, and kings. And so the author's saying, hey, let's not go back to that place where there was distance in relationship and there was only a select few of people that could actually even come before me. And let's not go back to that place where there's all of these laws you had to keep and you couldn't even do that well. And there would have to be these sacrifices and all of this stuff. Let's not do that. Let's not go back. There's a better covenant. How many know that the new covenant changes everything? New covenant changes everything. And we said at the beginning, at the core of every covenant is a change in relationship. And this is what happens. God was looking to change the way people related to him. In fact, the old covenant was established by God, but it was temporary because God was looking forward to a day when the relationship would change and we would actually be in close, intimate relationship with him. And so this old covenant was temporary. It was established by God. It was required, but it was temporary because the new covenant was coming, and God was anticipating the day when all of us could be in right relationship with him. And we see Jesus, you remember the famous Last Supper? Again, you remember covenants, sacrifices, meals. Jesus is in that famous Last Supper with his best friends, and he says this in Luke 22, verse 20. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the what? The new covenant. It's the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. In fact, every time we do this, when we do communion and we take the cup and we take the bread, we are reminding ourselves, it's like in some ways, we're kind of re-upping our vows. And we're just saying, hey, I still remember the new covenant that I'm in with you, where you do all of that and I believe. And I love you back. It's like this new covenant is it's almost too good to be true. It's like the old covenant was, you do all of this, and God does this. And the new covenant was God doing all the heavy lifting. Oh, man. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that just like, sometimes we're like, well, wait a minute. I want a little bit more. I want a little more requirements. Any of you, you don't have to raise your hand. Any of you are like, I would like some more requirements, please, God. I would like some more to do. I would like a little bit more effort here on my end so that it feels like I've done my part to be in this. And God's like, my part was perfect. My part was perfect. It was called the cross, the death, burial, and resurrection. You know that you'll never ever live up to his side of the covenant without Jesus. It's huge. Like, his way is better. His way is way better. Hebrews chapter 10 in verse 8 says, first he said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, though they were offered in accordance with the law. Then he said, here I am. I have come to do your will. He sets aside the first to establish the second. And by that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. It's interesting here because God established the old covenant and all of the processes, all the sacrifices and everything. But at a heart level, it says here, God didn't even desire that. What he was desiring was looking forward hundreds of years into the future when his son would come and there would be greater relationship. There'd be a new covenant. This was temporary. He's like, I didn't really desire that. Like, that wasn't, like, I didn't want this to be forever. God didn't want it to be forever. I like Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. By calling this covenant new, he's made the first one, what? Obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. In other words, get this, like he's trying to get this through to his audience. He's like, get this, even if you want to go back to it, you can't. In fact, you can go back to it in your mind and in your heart, but you can't go back to it in practice anymore. He's like pleading with them, don't go back, because if you go back, you're going to realize it's not there. This is the only thing available to you now. You can't relate to God in any type of success under this, because this isn't here anymore. Now, I don't know if the author prophetically was speaking about the temple that would eventually, in just a few years, be destroyed, and so they wouldn't be able to do sacrifices anymore. Or if somehow this was a symbolic thing. But man, eventually, isn't that just interesting that in a few years, there would be no way to do that anyways? I mean, this is huge. Can I just say, man, we're getting to the good part, but man, if you're trying to relate to God under the old covenant, it doesn't work. And the main reason is he relates to you through the new covenant. If you're trying to relate to him through the old covenant, how's that working out for you? And so unfortunately, what was made obsolete has remained intact for many people. Two types of Christians we find. It's usually old covenant Christians and new covenant Christians. A lot of people think they're in the new covenant with God, but they're actually operating out of the old covenant. Here, let's land this here, okay? Some of you are like, please. Let's land this. Hebrews 8 through 9. But God found fault with the people and said, the days are coming. And watch this. This is probably, I think this is Jeremiah that he's quoting, actually. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Right, Jeremiah, Old Testament prophet, like he's seeing into the future, like this covenant, this is temporary. There's a better one coming. I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. Can I make a shock value statement? It's not really a shock value statement, but can I just drop it and let you just hear it for just a minute? Watch. God's not asking you to keep the 10 Commandments. Paul said that the law will bring you death, and you'll never be able to do it, and you'll always be miserable. The old covenant didn't work because people didn't remain faithful. And in fact, they couldn't remain faithful. Did you know that? It was temporary. That's why the sacrifices, year after year, year after year. And the blood would just cover sin. It wouldn't wipe it away. Like now under the new covenant, when you confess your sins, like it's just as if you hadn't sinned. In the old covenant, it was just like it was a covering over. Hebrews 8:10. Watch this. Well, no, let me back up. The old covenant is externally driven. Rules on a tablet, 10 commandments, list of do's and don'ts. It's external. It's like a marriage that allows the internal love to die. Any of you relate to that? Any of you watching online? You're in a marriage where the internal part is dead. It's only the external. You're married for the kids. You're married for tax benefits. You're married for something else other than why you originally came together in the first place. When you stood before God and his people and said, for you and you alone till death do us part. The new covenant is internally driven. Hebrews 8:10, this is the covenant. Watch, this is what God's saying to you and to me. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. His desire is not that you live by an external list of do's and don'ts. His desire is that that list of do's and don'ts was written on your heart and on your mind, so internally you're motivated instead of externally. Jesus put it this way. I'll tell you what, man. I grew up. Maybe some of you, and I'm saying probably even when I was an adult, because it didn't change fast for me because I'm a slow cooker. I read this verse, interpreted it the wrong way, like probably many of us in this room and online have. John 14, verse 15. If you love me, keep my commandments. You ever read that? Have you ever read that and interpreted it the way I did? If you love me, you'll prove it to me because you'll do what I told you to do. Have you ever read it like that? If you love me, you'll prove it to me because you'll do what I told you to do. When I had just a revelation encounter with the Father's love and the grace of God, I started realizing, oh, wait a minute. If you love me, this stuff isn't hard, is what he's saying. If you love me, this whole thing is summed up in love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. He's like, if you love me, if there's an internal motivation of love for the Father, of love for Jesus, then this stuff, this external stuff, that's not hard anymore. But watch this. If you're not in love with him, it's really hard. If you're not in love with Jesus, if you're not in love with the Father, if there's not a love motivation out of your heart, man, it's almost impossible. This stuff is miserable. This stuff, this Christianity thing is a burden. But when you're in love, it becomes your delight, not your duty. Isn't that how it is at the beginning of relationships? It's like you almost don't even have to try to, like when Becky and I first met, we were 2 hours apart, long distance relationship. Man, I would jump in the car and go hang out, and then come back that same day. And it was like, hey, this wasn't even a thing. I'm not even tired. We talk on the phone the whole time. And I remember one time I'm driving home late at night and she's on the phone with me and I'm like, don't you need to go to bed so you can get up in the morning and go to work? And she's like, I just want to stay awake with you. And I'm like, that was the moment I knew that I loved her. It wasn't even hard. The old covenant has a master. The new covenant has a father. In the old covenant, you owe. In the new covenant, you inherit. Right? We're co-heirs with Christ. In the old covenant, it has guilt and shame. In the new covenant, it has cleansing. Come on, man. You really want to go back? Do you really want to go back? I can hear the author talking to the audience and saying, really? Like, who has clouded your judgment? It's like the author to Galatians, right? Paul, like who's cut in on you to keep you from running the race? Come on. It's so much better. Watch this. You know that God doesn't become angry with those that have walked through the cross? Like, if you haven't walked through the cross, you don't get the benefit of the cross, by the way. Like, if you haven't, and that's not shooting that at you, I'm just saying, there's benefits to the covenant that you get to be a part of. Like, there's blessings, there's a benefit. If you enter into relationship with Jesus, there is so much blessing. It's awesome. If you haven't walked through that, then I'd like to tell you about it, but you don't get to partake in that until you do. Like, God doesn't become angry with those that have walked through the cross. Why? Because his anger and wrath was completely satisfied at the cross. It's called propitiation. It's a big theology word. Just, you all right if I just drop words just to make myself sound smarter? Like, his wrath towards sin was completely satisfied at the cross, because the Bible says that he who knew no sin became sin so that we could be the righteousness of God. And so what sin does in our life now is it puts relational gap between us and him, not because he moves, but because we move. And he's saying, hey, I want you. Do you know that's how Hebrews 4 works? Because he says, you can come, what? Boldly to the what? Throne of what? Grace with confidence to receive mercy in your time of need. In other words, I don't have to come because God's this big bad guy with a baseball bat looking to bop me over the head because of how bad I've been. No, I can stand up with my shoulders back and come boldly before the throne of grace to a good Father who says, hey, let's get back in relationship, buddy. And Hebrews 8, verse 12 says this, I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins. What? No more. And so here, what kind of covenant are you in? What kind of covenant are you in? Or do you look at this and you're like, man, I've been relating to God under an old covenant? Or are you relating to God under a new covenant? Do you go back and forth? Kelly and your team, you can come. Man, I just remember there was probably about maybe 13 years ago or so that there was this revelation. It was before I came to this church. It was not last year. I was in Cedar Rapids at my uncle's ministry, and we started reading a book called Culture of Honor by Danny Silk. And it was one of those, you ever read a book and it was where have you been my whole life? This paradigm shifting thing. And that started happening. And then we came out here, a whole long story, man, a great God story, how God brought us out to Spirit of Life and everything. And then it was somewhere during that first year or so that I had listened to some messages from a pastor near Dallas called Robert Morris. And there was all of these messages on grace. And it was no way. I had no idea. I mean, I can remember times where it was just I'm floored. I've been a pastor and I've been leading people and I'm like, where's been this message of grace this whole time? Where's this thing that the cross was that good and Jesus was that good? Where's this place of internal motivation instead of external motivation? Come on. Somebody, why didn't you tell me? So maybe I can tell you this morning. In fact, you know what some marriages do? they get so far down the line, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, it's starting to get stale, it's starting to get into a rut. And you know what they do? They look at each other. Maybe they do it officially before a pastor or something, and they renew their vows. They re-up. And you can do that ever so often when we do like communion and things, but I thought, man, wouldn't this be a cool moment for you to just, before the Lord, re-up? It may have gotten dry. It may have gotten stale. There may have been ruts. You may have been finding that you started out in a new covenant relationship with the Lord, and somewhere over time, like you started to work for what you got for free. And the Lord's saying, would you re-up with me? Would you renew your love and your commitment with me? Because he's saying this. He's like, I've been relating to you out of the new covenant this whole time. I just think maybe before we stand up and close in a song, would you just, if you're willing, would you just take a moment right there with the Lord? Just right where you're sitting. Would you just be honest with yourself and honest with the Lord? Are you in an old covenant relationship or a new covenant relationship? I love it, like when there's sin involved, like God knows what to do with sin. All you need to do, would you just, under your breath, just confess it? You know what it is. Would you just confess it? Here's the truth. He says, if you confess your sin, I'm faithful and I'm just, and I'll forgive you your sin, and I'll what? I'll cleanse you of all unrighteousness. It just takes you before him saying, God, man, this is what I did. I'm sorry. Would you allow the new covenant to just wash over you right now? Jesus. Would you let him relate to you as a father instead of a master right now? Would you let him write his expectations on your heart and on your mind right now so that you can be internally driven instead of externally driven? Jesus. And if you're willing and ready, you can stand with me. We're going to close out here with a worship song. If you need to still spend time with the Lord, if you're not done, just do whatever God's wanting you to do. But the rest of us, let's just stand and, Lord, all over this place, we just come into agreement with your new covenant right now. Lord, man, it's so hard to do it in our own strength, God. Lord, I thank you that your word says that you've actually put your spirit inside of us to empower us to live rightly. Lord, would you just empower at a greater level every person at the sound of my voice in this room and those watching online? Lord, help us to not go back in our heart and our minds to what was old and dying and obsolete. Help us to fully embrace you this morning. We love you, Jesus. Amen. There may be some of you in this room that just want someone to stand in prayer with you for anything this morning. Could be something got just triggered by the Lord in this message. It could be anything that you're going through, anything at all that you want prayer. And we'll have some people up front here ready and willing to pray with you here in just a few minutes. God bless you. Love you guys.